And it's not an end in itself. Boycotting Israel is not an end in itself. Boycotting Israel is about making change. It's about shifting the balance of power so that Palestinians are not totally disempowered, but that they have force and strength behind them to put their justified demands on the table. So I think that people who care about Israel more than they care about Palestinians even should be signing on to BDS and should, you know, get away from this false notion, if we just talk, if we just keep talking endlessly, things will change. Because no, they won't. That's not how power works. Yes, sir.
You talked about the kind of the Israeli government's control of goods going in, the flow of goods in and out of Gaza. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the Israel's role in the kind of controlling the economy of the West Bank and the relationship between the production of settlement goods and businesses in the West Bank, and the relationship between the maintaining of settlements and Palestinian labor.
You know, this is a subject I won't claim to know more about than I do. However, you know, it's often a cliche that's said that, you know, one of the differences between South Africa and Israel is that in South Africa, the apartheid regime was more vulnerable because it was more dependent on black labor, whereas Israel is not as dependent on Palestinian labor. And I won't say that it's the same, but what I would say is that Israel is more dependent on Palestinian labor and Palestinian markets than is often admitted. And Israel's largest export market is the occupied Palestinian territories. Billions of dollars of Israeli consumer goods are exported to the West Bank and Gaza every year, and this is because these are capital markets. I mean, effectively, Israel has a monopoly on many goods in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. I mentioned that Palestinian, construction, settlement, one of the ironies of the settlement construction is that it's almost all done with Palestinian labor. This isn't because Palestinians are happy to be building settlements that are effectively helping Israel to steal their land, but because Israel has what Harvard scholar Sarah Roy called engaged in the de-development of the Palestinian territories. It has not only not allowed Palestinians to develop their own economy, but it's taken measures that have reversed that. And so what you have, you'll hear this kind of economic myth that particularly pushed in the last couple of years. It's part of the political science fiction that the United States has been pushing, that, oh, you know, the West Bank has all this economic growth and all this entrepreneurialism, and because they have this guy, Salam Fayyad, who was handpicked by the United States as the former IMF official, everything is going fantastic in the West Bank. They have shopping malls, they have cinemas. All this is the narrative that is being pushed by Israel and the United States and some in the Palestinian Authority in order to, again, boost the political science fiction of a nascent Palestinian state. If the Palestinians behave, if they follow the rules, if they don't follow those nasty people with beards called Hamas, then they will get their rewards in terms of shopping malls and cineplexes. The reality is that this is pure nonsense. Yes, there is some, what you have is an elite in the West Bank that is benefiting and is doing very well. This is more a sign of inequality than prosperity. And that's true in the United States and around the world as well. And particularly around Ramallah, which is often described as a bubble. And when you actually look at the economic figures, where they say that you've had 9% economic growth in the West Bank in 2009, 2010, the vast majority, according to the IMF and the World Bank, of that so-called economic growth is two sources, foreign aid and income from settlement construction, wages from settlement construction. Investment in new businesses, exports, this kind of thing that would give the sign of sort of a healthy economy, nil. You've actually had all the job growth has come from public sector hiring, putting people on the payroll. And when you talk about the foreign aid, we're not talking about foreign aid in the sense that this has contributed to investment in infrastructure or in projects that have been sustainable. This is a direct subsidy for wages to, for people who are largely doing nothing in the Palestinian Authority bureaucracy. So you have Palestinians being converted from, people engaged in business, agriculture, particularly small businesses, to becoming dependent on wages that are paid by the European Union and the United States. And this is, of course, a means of political control. Because if you don't behave and do what we want, we cut off the wages. And this, of course, has been the constant crisis of the Palestinian Authority over recent years. We can't make payroll at the end of the month because the money's not coming through from the Europeans or the Americans, or Israel is withholding the tax money. So it's created, foreign aid has created more Palestinian dependency, and all of this is being marketed fictitiously and deceitfully as economic growth. I see on Twitter that we're supposed to be wrapping up. No? Okay. Oh, all right. I'm sorry I can't live tweet the event, but I can at least follow it on. But it's not, I'm happy to go on for a bit. It's 9:45. What if we take everyone who has their hand up now, and you go ahead and make your question or comment one after the other, and then I'll wrap up all together so everyone has a chance to speak. Does that sound okay? Mm-hmm. So we have, I'll start with people who haven't spoken before. 1, 2, 3, and then 4. Was there anyone else speak now or forever hold your peace? Okay. Go ahead, sir.
Can you tell us a little bit about the rationing of water in the West Bank?
Okay. I'll take notes and then I'll come back to them all together.
So my question is kind of big, so bear with me. But I really appreciate your use of the language of apartheid because it is this system that is sort of unable to be ignored. And I guess my concern and question revolves around the fact that Israel as a society, in addressing Israeli citizens, has like very little language or discourse around societal injustice. And like, for example, I've never really seen, or I have family in this area, and there just seems to be no language or room for talking about like social injustice among Israeli citizens, and then absolutely no language when it comes to the issue of the Palestinian occupation as an apartheid or a system of oppression. So I guess what I'm trying to ask you is, how do you see it possible to introduce this type of discourse and language in Israeli society, especially when you were saying earlier, like a lot of this work will come from the university in America and internationally, but like the same sort of like time holder that we have here at Oberlin or at the university for creating that discourse and dissent in Israel, it's spent in the army. So I guess I kind of have no hope in, and I would like to hear your view on how to introduce sort of frameworks of anti-oppression or some more critical culture theory. And then I guess my only solution to seeing that as possible is really that it does, all the work really does lie on the American Jews to convince Jews in Israel that this sort of language and discourse needs to start happening. I don't know. I guess that's just where I'm coming from. I guess I can't I can see it as really an easy step forward for like all of us in this room and in the States to work towards like really naming what's going on as apartheid, but I can't see that happening in Israel. And it's upsetting.
Okay.
What actions do you think Palestinians can and should take to help and to try to end Israeli apartheid? Since you talked a lot about EDS, which is more of like an international movement.
Okay.
Quick, you talked about 6 million Palestinians inside, but are there 6 million people in the diaspora, the Gulf, North America, Europe? Are they active or passive? What's their role? What hope do you have for Palestinians in the diaspora? They're just as equal as the ones there, or are they?
Very good questions. Water. There is a lot of studies on water, so I can only just give you some headlines. But as with every other resource, there's a huge disparity in access to water and use of water. In the West Bank, Palestinians are not even allowed to dig wells on their own land without permission from the occupation. And much of the water supplies for the country come from 2 aquifers under the West Bank, which Israel controls. And it extracts the water and sells it back to Palestinians at a very high price. But many Palestinians have very insufficient water supplies and are reliant on buying water from private sources by the tanker, which is very, very expensive. So it's very common in summer for Palestinians to suffer from extreme shortages of water for basic needs, while settlers famously have swimming pools and lawns and these lush surroundings. But even more than the swimming pools and the lawns is Israel's wasteful use of water on really unsustainable agricultural and environmental practices. Growing crops that are just not suited to the kind of water resources. I mean, Israel is exporting things like peppers and tomatoes and potatoes to Europe, which can grow much better potatoes and peppers and so on. But what is a tomato or a pepper? It's 98% water. So they're basically exporting water to markets that they're perfectly capable of producing their own produce. So crops that are totally unsuited, while destroying indigenous crops that are much better suited to the climate, like olives and citrus and other things that are less dependent on artificial irrigation. So the water disparities, and again the studies, I don't want to quote exact figures, but they're generally in the order of Israelis using 5 units of water for every 1 that Palestinians use per capita. So that gives you a sense of the disparity. Your question is a very good one. And I think language and discourse and how we talk about things is very related to our power position. And I think it's so important to understand that. I mean, I wrote this book, and as was mentioned, I have a few copies I hope will not have to come back in my suitcase. But this book was an attempt to put forward a discourse that is clear about issues of justice, but also inclusive, that empathizes, and that was my effort, and certainly an inadequate one. But I'm under no illusion that I can go to Israelis who have these hardcore views and persuade them and argue them out of these views. In my experience, that's almost impossible to do, and that's because I think Israelis who hold those kinds of views feel themselves to be in an unassailable position of power, and at the same time have built around this a discourse of victimhood which disguises that power. So they're in a position of immense power.
Thank you so much, Ali Abunimah, for being with us. We have books down here.